everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. This week on our panel, we have Lee. Lee, do you want to say hi? You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. This is Lee Whalen from the greatest DevOps company nobody's ever heard of, Fuzzy Logic Systems.
Nice. We also have Scott.
Hey, Scott Nixon from Cloud Mechanics out in Oregon.
Nice. I'm going to be out in Oregon in a few weeks. I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I'm filling in for Nell this week, and we have a special guest, and that is Priyanka Sharma from GitLab. Priyanka, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell everybody why you're so awesome and what you're doing here.
Thank you, Chuck. Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Priyanka, and I serve as Director of Technical Evangelism at GitLab. The role is very similar to Director of Developer Advocacy or Developer Relations in other companies. And I also sit on the board of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
That sounds fancy.
It's all a bunch of words.
Yep. Now, Priyanka and I, we met at Velocity a couple of weeks ago and got this all lined up. And so, yeah, I was kind of excited to get on here. And, then Nell said she was going to be out of town. And I was like, all right, well, this is my chance. So, let's get in and let's talk about this for a minute. You gave us a couple of options. We opted to talk about the toolchain crisis. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a 2-minute introduction to the topic. Let us know what you're thinking there. And then we can kind of discuss it from there.
Yes, absolutely. So when referring to the toolchain crisis, I'm talking about the complicated choices that enterprises and smaller companies have to make when they are deciding how to set up their software development, security, and operations lifecycle. As some of you may remember, about 2-3 years ago is when Kubernetes really started taking off. Parallel to that taking off, microservices started becoming a thing. We all started developing software differently than we did, let's say, 5 years ago. Cloud computing is, I think, the reason that all this happened, because suddenly you can spin things up and down way faster than if you were running your own infrastructure. Once that started happening and then Kubernetes became big, we as an ecosystem got really excited about operationalizing this new way of developing software because the old ways didn't work anymore. So there's suddenly been an onslaught of so many open source projects, vendors, etc., that are out there solving very specific problems. And for each problem, there's probably 20 solutions out there. And that brings forth the toolchain crisis, where microservices-oriented companies, every team is picking their own toolchain, and then compound that by the number of teams, and suddenly an organization has 50, 60 tools that they're using across the board. What that leads to is there's no cohesion in a company, and information is not passed easily. So the ultimate goal with which we all got excited with Kubernetes and Cloud Native and Shift Left is actually being held back because developers don't know what's happening in a different team's workflow. They don't know where something is. They don't have the ability to jump in and contribute quickly, which is essential to shipping faster, which is what this whole thing is about. So that's kind of the toolchain crisis, where we have too many options. Many people have chosen many options, and suddenly we're in a state of chaos, and that's costing us. Most importantly, in terms of cycle time, just because people don't have the information they need. They don't know how to jump in and collaborate because they're not in the same tools. And then there's also just so many screens to look at that there's that huge human cost of context switching.
Yeah, I love the solution that people put forward. Well, everybody should just use my favorite cloud vendor.
Exactly. Fill in the blank, right?
Yeah. Lee and Scott, I'm curious, have you seen this and how do you deal with it?
Oh, yes. We see this, well, not, but I and my company, because we work with a variety of different companies in a variety of different contexts, there is a ton of choices that startups today and even mature businesses can pick from. So it might be like Jenkins or Jenkins X in one company, and then they're working through they're trying to migrate off to Travis, or maybe they're really happy with Jenkins. Or I've seen some companies that are very happy with GitLab and GitLab CI, but it's just ever so slightly different. And yeah, there is an embarrassment of options, and even stuff that on the surface seems like it should be fairly similar. Like Amazon's EKS and GCP's Kubernetes deploy. It's a situation where the big print giveth and the small print taketh away. Where it's like, oh, look, I should be able just to copy this. Oh, no, there's, it's death by 1,000 cuts of differences here, everywhere. And yeah, it can get pretty crazy.
Yeah, I find that oftentimes you go into organizations and they're not using any kind of automation tools, whether it's Ansible or Puppet or Chef, and they just don't know where to kind of start or what to choose. And I think, I don't know, it's definitely all across, how many CI/CD platforms are there now? And I mean, it just kind of is, there's no good metrics, matrices that you can go to and go, oh, here's all the features I need. And then, it's just like you can spend hours and hours and hours testing things out and trying things. And that's why, and I actually think, it's not always the worst thing in the world that somebody goes, well, this is the thing I'm the most comfortable with. And so I'm going to use this, but,
yeah. The other thing, and so I'm building a software as a service right now for podcasters. And so I'm trying to make some of these decisions myself. And one of the things that I run into as well is not just, okay, which of these is going to do the job for me now? But I don't know what level of adoption I'm going to get. I don't know what kinds of features people are going to ask for. And so I may pick a vendor and then turn out that, oh, okay, I've moved off in this other direction I didn't anticipate. And all of a sudden, this tool doesn't have what I need anymore. And so it's not just, oh, gee, this is going to work for me. Great. But it's also, is this going to work for me a year down the line or 3 months down the line, as things change?
Shameless plug. You should try GitLab, which is a single application. I just point that out just because I think these challenges that you talk about are very real. When you're starting a startup, a nonprofit, or open source project, you don't want to be wasting time on these questions, right? You probably want to build what your key features are going to be, what is going to be your differentiator, and not have to waste time on these questions every day.
Yeah, exactly. Well, especially, whether you're doing DevOps or whether you're doing development, because I kind of straddle the fence depending on what part of my particular solution I'm working on. I just want to make sure it'll scale, right? I don't want to worry about what tools I'm running, right? It's the same thing with, development. I don't want to care which library I'm using to upload images. I just want the images uploaded and resized the right way. And so, yeah, what you're saying is really, kind of the crux of what we're talking about here. In the end, it doesn't matter which CI solution I'm using as long as it's getting the job done.
Yeah, the same thing you're saying, I've heard from so many diverse people doing different things that it's definitely a unifying message, I think. I was speaking with someone who is running a nonprofit that does machine learning from state-provided data sets on the opioid crisis. And what they figure out based on the data is how much of, the antidote they should carry in emergency responder vehicles so that people can get it when there is an emergency and their lives be saved. They really don't want to care about the CI pipelines and the logging and the monitoring and which tool to use today, tomorrow, day after. They want to save lives. And a completely different product on a very different spectrum is like cloud native projects. So I was talking to Fluentd, who is starting to use GitLab CI, and same story where they're like, we want to ship the best log aggregator out there as opposed to figuring out our entire pipeline and this and that. So this is true regardless of what you are building. And that's been very inspiring for me to see. Because in the past, I came from a point solution background. I was working on observability tooling. And it's my favorite space. But it's interesting that when you go super deep in a space, you realize very specific, unique problems. But then when you up level to look at the entire life cycle, you're like, wait a minute, we need to provide cohesion throughout the workflow and not just in one corner, tiny part of what the DevOps lifecycle was like.
So how do we avert this crisis then? How do we solve this?
I think that's a great question and a work in progress for the industry at large. I have some thoughts, which I am happy to share. These are my opinions, so please know that. Basically, what I've seen across organizations is that bringing order to the chaos is a must. I think the days of ad hoc trying random solutions and projects are gone. I think there's general, like the baseline awareness in the industry is such that we all agree that you don't just go willy-nilly trying out projects and tools and like adopting all of them. I do think there was a time 2 years ago when that was not the case. So we've already made progress. What I have learned, and this is the philosophy that's inspired the GitLab single application a lot, is the point that ultimately what you need to do is help your developers shift left, and you have to meet them where they are comfortable. So if you want to ship fast and respond to the market, you want to help your developers know what happens beyond shipping a feature into operationalizing it, right? To do that, you can ask them to learn 200 different tools, or you can bring the tools into their workflow that they're comfortable with and used to. So I think that's a really good sort of mantra to follow, is like, you're asking a developer to change how they work like by almost 50%, meet them halfway and be in the toolchain that they're used to. Then the second thing is, in my opinion, it's very important to think of what you want these people to achieve. You want all the developers in the company to know what is happening where, so that when it's their turn to jump in and collaborate, which often happens with microservices-based architectures where there's lots of handoffs, they need to know when it's going to be handed off to them. So they jump in and start working on their piece, as opposed to being, sitting around, they'll let me know when it's my turn. So there's the visibility piece, which is knowing what's happening. There's the collaboration piece, where it needs to be easy to collaborate. And then finally, there's guardrails. It's really important to make people feel secure that whatever work they're doing is really not going to bring the whole system down. And there are safeguards in place. There is the basics of observability in place that takes care of those, abstracts some of the operational stuff away from every feature's development. So I think those are 3 mantras to follow. Having a unified data model across all of the tooling, or majority of the tooling, is going to really help as you're going to do that, just because, then there's a baseline of knowledge that will be passed on throughout the workflow. How you do it, everybody does things differently. In the GitLab single application model, people can literally go from planning their features to source code management, to CI/CD, to post-production monitoring and security. And that's one way of doing it. But at the same time, the reality remains that there are certain aspects of a code base where you may need a very sharp tool. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the key, though, is to integrate that really well into some hub-like or model, which is like a single application like GitLab, where there's minimal such external tools like integrating into it, so that you fulfill the needs that you have, but at the same time retain the sanity and the workflow seamlessness that I think really helps developers. So that's my take based on what I've seen at GitLab, working with over 100,000 organizations, as well as my past life in observability. So those are my 20 cents.
So I have a question. What are some examples of how you go about starting this data modeling process, from your opinion?
Sure. So in the specific case of GitLab, because it's a single application, it's built on one data model. And so that's super easy, right? However, when you are, let's say, looking at multiple tools, then if there's a way, like, you can pass on identifiers. So in the world of tracing, which was my past world in observability, we used to like trace ID or any kind of identifier, whatever you call it, like correlation ID, trace ID, whatever. As long as you could track that across the system, and this we're talking obviously now in the operations space, you were able to detect problems and fix them and get to the root cause. I think if we can get similar and more and more similar in the workflow world, where context is propagated, the better you're going to do. And in the GitLab case, because it's a single application, it's the same data model.
I also had the question about, you mentioned the idea about providing guardrails to the developers. What are some suggestions you have around that?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is where, in my opinion, it is helpful to have like a tooling department or a team in a company. Somebody needs to be thinking very deeply and carefully about what permissions to set up, what kind of PII scrubbing to have, these are just examples. Or how, how can you surface security issues to developers as they're developing code. Again, many ways to achieve the same results. In our world of GitLab, what happens is that what can happen, it's all optional, right, how you configure the system. But what can happen is that when you run a CI/CD pipeline, the merge request, which is similar to the pull request model in GitHub, so that gets populated with information on, security scans, whether it's open source, whether it's looking at dependency scanning, whether it's looking at, code quality tests, etc. And so within the merge request, pull request itself, the developer can see what's going on, and then they can go in and fix those problems. That is really nice for the developer. They didn't set up that system, but they're benefiting from it, right? And it's very, very clear to said developer that if there's a potential big issue, it's no longer a thing of oh, I had no idea. So that's one example. And then there's also permissions. So for example, you want your company, I encourage, if people can't be open source, which I understand can be a little intimidating or just impossible given what business you're in, at least inner source, right? And there are actually a lot of organizations and companies that have recently come talk to us about that. When you want to encourage inner sourcing, most of the time you're coming from a completely closed system. So people are scared because they're well, I was used to just having access to my project just to myself until I was ready to show it off to the world. And here we are talking about everybody can see what I'm doing. And that's stressful. So education around and, guidelines around when does a project become open for people to see? What are some parts of the code base that for, regulation reasons or whatever it might be can never be shown? And so it shouldn't be a situation that you're starting inner sourcing and by mistake these two very, very sensitive pieces of your software system are exposed. The developers need to have that kind of trust in the tooling that's not going to happen. And I think that's where, going back to the original point, it's helpful to have a tooling team that looks at all these at all these business reasons on how they should open up the software system and at the same time not put people in trouble.
How that sounds awesome. that is a great goal to shoot for. And I can especially see how in a smaller organization or even a relatively new company, being able to come in with a does it all solution makes all that just crazy easy. How about in older, larger, or more established companies that they may already have a tooling department? How would you go about overcoming some not invented here syndrome, where something just for example, something we're both familiar with, GitLab. I'm a big fan of GitLab. Fuzzy Logic uses it internally, soup to nuts. We recommend it, when it's a good fit for our clients. But a lot of times, the GitLab ecosystem will overlap with a tool that was developed within the company, and they're like, oh yeah, well GitLab needs it needs to replace this other tool that we've even though it may be superior to our inferior tool that the developer who originally wrote it left months ago, but this is our garbage pile, and so we're going to keep our garbage pile even though we have something new and actively developed that's gonna do it. How would you go about fighting some of that not invented here syndrome? Or have you seen that, rather?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that is one of the biggest challenges any tool can face when it comes to adoption across companies and organizations. So I think your question was, how do you combat the not invented here syndrome, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say it depends. So, of course, as with everything, it depends.
Of course.
But there are scenarios where I would venture that just because of some, if some tool is very deeply integrated into a system and they've just built it and it's so awesome, there's no reason to, like, if it's not broken, don't fix it, I think is a true scenario. But it's really important to recognize when it is broken. And I think these are not invented here is one of the most challenging things any person trying to bring change in an organization faces, just because it's very emotional. It's an emotional response where, like, you have pride in what you built. Like, it may be ugly, but it's ours, kind of a thing. And so that's a factor to consider. And we're still at this point in time, human beings working on software systems. So you can't really fight against that. I do think what's possible is slow education. So let's take the example of GitLab, right? When it comes to source code management, I'd venture most companies are not building their own. I don't think they are at all. And that's an easy entry point, right? Because no one's really trying to build their own. It would be a total pain in the ass. Sorry. It would be a total pain.
It's good. Keep going.
Vanity. Oh, gracious.
To build your own. And that's a great entry point. Now, the way the GitLab tool, our single application, is set up is that when you buy whatever piece of the software that you do, you get it all. It's just not, you're just not using it. And that actually has been a great strategy for us, just because over time, most tech professionals are curious people, or most people are curious, and they look around, check out what the different parts of the system are, and slowly a fan following develops because there is real value in the offering as a whole. And so specifically GitLab as a company is a very strong land and expand model just because of this strategy. And that does mean that we have to be patient. We won't, have everybody using all the stages of the GitLab product in 6 months, but over the course of 2 to 3 years, it's very, very strong adoption across multiple stages. So that's kind of how we've seen it work, where you're not actually sort of butting heads with people to combat their point of view, because it's like telling someone, it's almost like telling someone how to feel, and that never works, right? And so, but when you just present the option and be like, cool, whatever, you do you, then over time we've seen it work really.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry.
One area that I want to jump in on with this a little bit is you mentioned, it depends a little bit on the outcomes you want. And I think this is where a lot of the problem of having a DevOps tools crisis comes from, is that a lot of companies, they kind of ad hoc their way into their DevOps setup. It's, oh, now we need to manage these servers. Oh, now we're going to move to Kubernetes. Now we're going to try and do microservices. Oh, let's pull in some more cloud architecture and maybe do Lambda functions or something. And then, oh, well, there's this other part of this thing in the cloud, so we're gonna move our database over there. And they never really have a clear direction as far as what the outcome is they want. And so picking the right tool for an outcome that's not clear is really tough. So how do people start prioritizing the things that they need to know about and plan for so that they can actually make the decisions that you talked about earlier?
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for asking. So I think last year at KubeCon in Seattle, I held a panel which had engineering leaders from Delta, CVS, T-Mobile, and Lyft talking about their DevOps journeys. And this was something that came up. And I think a really good point of view put forth by Matt Klein, who is actually the creator of the Envoy project in CNCF, and he works at Lyft, was that it is okay to go incrementally. In fact, it's often the only way. I think in a year or two, things would be a little different just because there'll be so many case studies and examples of how to make this transformation. But in terms of today, let's talk about today. It's normal to bite off chunks and then go from there. Now, how do you choose tooling that resonates with, that prepares you for the future while you're going incrementally? It's a challenge for most organizations. In the specific GitLab case, it's a little more straightforward just because you start with something and it'll scale with you and it'll change with the world around you just because we are an opinionated offering. So that's one point of view. But when we generalize, I would say that it's important to, if you're biting off a small piece, focus on that small piece. So for example, if you are, actually, I'll give you an example. In terms of GitLab, the product, how we run our engineering, we are currently moving all of ourselves to Kubernetes. So we're in a very similar boat to a lot of our customers, which creates a level of empathy, that I think is really useful. But as GitLab is moving towards Kubernetes, we could have made the choice to go all in and gung-ho and build our continuous deployment system based on Kubernetes. But we actually have chosen not to do that. We have chosen to build our internal continuous deployment system off of VMs right now, because we are going to push our legacy CI/CD system to the max while we are service by service moving to Kubernetes. When that piece is done is when we will evaluate exactly how to modernize our own CI/CD. And so we didn't lock, stock, and barrel put all our eggs in one basket for multiple reasons. One is that in the theoretical, abstract point of view, yeah, totally, let's go all in is a great idea. But when it comes to reality, you have to change people's behaviors and workflow practices, and that takes a lot longer than just turning the switch on in some technology. So I think if you are scoping, if you are going, step by step, truly go step by step and don't adopt everything that is going to come at once. And if you make the changes slowly, it's easier to revert back to. This is also actually a GitLab philosophy of the minimum viable change, which is true for everything from documents you write to videos to the to product features to how we run our own infrastructure, which is go bit by bit and don't disturb the rest while you're going bit by bit. And I think that leads to more thoughtful tooling decisions. And ultimately, even if people decide to change the direction they're going in, they don't have to sort of rework everything. It's, you made lots of small decisions, so reverting at each decision point is easier.
That's a lot to absorb.
Yeah.
I know there's just so much we can all do, but human progress is slow. The machines are fast. It's we humans that's a little bit the problem, but I think we're working hard and doing our best, all of us.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I have to screw it up about a dozen times before I get it.
Same here.
Well, I think it's there's so much to it. It's you have to do, I don't know, sometimes you have to go down that road to learn the lesson that you need to learn, the lesson to kind of get yourself on the right track. We all want to think that we can make the right choice the first time. And we try to research things extensively and we try to plan for all eventualities. But sometimes it's just, we have no, you can't plan for it. You just have to do it. Right.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And that's why I lean honestly towards on two things. One is the MVC model, right? The minimum viable change. So make small changes so you can revert back easier. And the third is always go for simplicity. I think simple is better in everything. If it sounds really complex and fancy, it probably is. And it's going to just cause a lot of frustration in teams. So I think it's really important to not over-engineer things. I have friends who are doing consulting these days, and they were telling me that some of them are data people. And they have been called in to companies to help out where people are yeah, we have the state-of-the-art system and we need you to build this data lake and data warehouse and this and that. And the guys, my friend's well, I can build that for you, no problem. But you have 10 transactions a month. You will need this when you have 10 million transactions a month. So why are we over-engineering this problem again? So that, I think we're all prone to it. As technologists, it's exciting to build something shiny and awesome and supercharged. But it's important to think about what do you need? What is the simplest thing you need? What is the minimum thing you need? And I think that is just a huge challenge for us just because our nature is innovation and building and super cool stuff.
Yeah. What is it about it that drives that premature optimization? Is it just, I don't know. It's just like, and maybe it's a priorities thing, really. It's like, you're not sure what you should be working on. So you're like planning for this massive event that hasn't come yet. So, and I've been there.
Same here. Yeah, I think it's just that, sometimes, and this may be because shift left hasn't fully happened in the ecosystem yet, infra teams forget why they're there. They're in service of a business, and that business may not be building the fanciest infrastructure setup out there. It may actually be something more basic than that, or something completely different than what the industry-wide patterns are that we hear of in all the infrastructure conferences. And so I think the disconnect between the business and the infra can be a challenge that leads to this. And then, in the startup world, you'll often see people then pivot from, a retail startup to a monitoring solution or something. And I'm like, okay, so they have a really solid infra team, and that product was better than what started out as the business model. So those funny things happen, I think.
I think the over-engineering side can also stem from a desire we just want to solve this problem once and then never have to look at it again. If you, in the physical world, if you can build a shed, and if you build it with, a poured concrete foundation and iron rebar, that thing's going to stand there, in a hurricane. You're going to have that shed until you die. Whereas in the infrastructure, and it's not, that much more effort to, go into building this bomb-proof shed, and then you get the shed problem solved the rest of your days. Where I think a lot of startups are like, hey, we have an infrastructure problem here. What is the latest hotness? Oh, it's Kubernetes with all the fixings. And as you said, it might not be a good fit. In fact, it might even be an anti-pattern because of, business reasons A through F. But, the big print says that, oh yeah, we'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. But then the small print's like, yeah, but we're going to take away A, B, and C, so on and so forth.
Yeah. And on that, just to give an example, I was talking to my father-in-law the other day, and I was telling him, oh yeah, I want to pour a concrete pad on the side of my house so that I can park all this stuff there. And then I want to put a shed in so that we can move all of the yard tools out to the shed. That's what made me think of it, with your example. And he says, well, why don't you just put gravel down on the side of your driveway behind the gate and then put a tarp over the lawn tools, right? It gets it out of your garage, and it's a lot less work. And sometimes, depending on where your company's at, that's the kind of DevOps you need for right now. You just need to put some gravel down, figuratively, put a tarp over it. Nothing's going to get ruined. And then you can move on to the other things that are more important, come back to it later.
Right. The minimum viable DevOps.
Yes, 100% agree. But it's so hard in practice because, I think we have to literally put Post-its on our computer to remind ourselves of this, I tend to get really into the weeds sometimes, and it is exciting and it's fun, but we got to keep the eye on the prize, right?
Right.
Yeah. The other thing is I get tied up around the feeling of boom, nailed it. Right. And so it's yeah. So I want to go build the shed because I nailed it. I got it done. Look what I did. It's beautiful. And yeah, the reality is that if I want to get as much done as possible and I want to do what serves my needs, yeah, it may just be overkill.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, I think the conversation you can have with yourself is, hey, I'm delaying actually properly dealing with this problem by putting down the gravel and putting a tarp over stuff, right? And it's kind of, my inclination would be like, well, would you really want to put a tarp over stuff, or would you still want to build the shed, but you just have the gravel driveway or something? I don't know. It's like you get into this bargaining thing about what, if that's really a good option or not. So, but no, it's a really fun example. So.
Analysis paralysis.
Yeah. One other thing I want to throw in here is that usually when I'm picking these systems, I'm picking them based on three things. And one is how well does it communicate to the people what it needs to communicate? One is the features, and I think we talked a bit about that. And the last one is how does it fit into my process? And a lot of times I find that as I talk to people, they're laser focused on one of those and they miss the other two. And so, I'm wondering if there's a process that we could put around this, or a start to a conversation that people can have in the company that they're working at, so that they make sure that they cover these things. And I don't know what that looks like, but I kind of like the actionable take of, hey, put these things on your list and make sure you get them covered.
So I can speak to that. At the panel that I hosted at KubeCon Seattle last year, the lady from Delta Airlines, her name's Jasmine Jacobs, she runs the tooling team over at Delta, and she had this amazing rubric to use when evaluating new tooling, and she calls it AEIOU. And there's a full list of what each letter stands for. I'm going to do my best to remember all of them. I know that E was for enterprise ready. I was integrated, how integratable it is into their current solution. And then there was U was like useful, but useful came at the end. And that was what really stuck to me, because most people will see which is the coolest feature set that can solve my problem. But for her, it was like, that's a baseline I look at the end. A tool needs to meet all these other criteria first. I'm actually going to pull up that list because I'm not remembering each one, and I'll share with you all. If you keep continuing talking, I'll put it right there. One sec.
It almost sounds similar to many moons ago when containers and Kubernetes were just starting to heat up. There was it was just a camera picture of a whiteboard around the production cliff, where it's, the developer has Docker on their laptop, and then they think it's good. But what they don't see is the production cliff in order to get it into production, where it also needs observability. It needs alerting. It needs, a real deploy system. It was probably a dozen different things. It's, I need to save that.
Security, networking, layer 7 proxy, all of those.
Exactly, yeah.
Now I'm getting scared. I mean, you're just listing off all these things and it's like, whoa.
Certificates.
Yeah. But that's the beauty, right, of having a process figured out for a lot of this stuff. Because then it's you just work through the system, and at the end you've covered most of the things that you need to have thought about. And so I like the mnemonic, the AEIOU, but ultimately, write out what you need to think through on all this stuff and then work through it.
Yeah. And it's, so I found the link, which is what I shared. And so basically in that, A is applicability, like, is this applicable to our system? Like, given whatever infrastructure we're running on, because some shiny tool may just, for example, something that only works for OpenShift and doesn't work for Kubernetes. It may be the coolest thing out there, but what are you going to do? Right. And then, with E is enterprise ready, as I spoke, which is self-explanatory, and integration means, can you actually integrate it well into your existing toolchain? And I think this is where that whole conversation about having a sane hub-based model for your tooling comes in, where like something may be super cool, but if it doesn't connect to anything else, you're going to have that much overhead with finding out the information in that tool, acting on it, etc. Then overhead is exactly like the overhead of training and all of the integration overhead that comes with it. And then U finally is usefulness. I really like this mnemonic because it really captures everything from my perspective.
Yeah, it's definitely easy to remember.
Yeah, so like Lee just shared like his little image on the learning cliff, and it goes from containers at the bottom to scheduling, replication, repeatable deployments, scaling up, down, application updates, high availability, security, load balancing. And there's probably more that can be on that list. Thanks for sharing that, Lee.
Just before the screaming hordes come for me, this is not my image. This is something I saw months, probably even years ago as a Twitter post. And just in searching for that from the VMware blog, that's where the actual image comes from.
Yeah. It'll be in the show notes, so I mean, easily accessible.
Well, the thing that's really sad about it is you look at that and then you add in more of the dev part of DevOps. And so each of those you can do the scheduling plus backend technology, scheduling plus front-end technology, scheduling plus mobile technology. And you just do that all the way up the stack. And it just, it just grows exponentially from there with everything that you add in.
Yeah, the complexity only grows. It doesn't get less. And I think part of it is almost intentional. Cloud native Foundation point of view, because they do not want to be like OpenStack, where it was very opinionated. And I think that has had some really good things because it has spurred innovation, but we're also at that peak chaos moment where the toolchain crisis type things happen because there's too many options. And there needs to be some way for us to sift through the madness and have some best practices. I think as an industry, we're getting better, but the more people that go cloud native, the more new complexities will emerge, and someone will have to solve the problem and then teach the rest of the world.
Definitely. That is a much more polite way of of something I like to say often is, when you build an idiot-proof system, nature will provide a better idiot.
That's really funny.
And many, many times I end up being that better idiot.
Hey, we're all at some point an idiot.
Too simple to fail. Challenge accepted.
Right.
I'm glad you brought up the Cloud Native Foundation. And so I guess I'm trying to, can you kind of, dig into that a little more? I'm definitely curious, the projects that end up on, referenced on their site, are these projects that they have some ownership in, or do they try to, I guess I'm trying to just figure out how those kind of come about.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been involved with the CNCF since, I guess, 2-3 years ago now. So, and when I joined, I got involved because the third project to join the foundation, Open Tracing, I was a part of the early folks on it. So I've seen things evolve. Yes, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation officially owns the IP of all the projects that are in it. IP includes logos and all of that stuff. So yes, that's the case. The way they get projects in. So the foundation was started with Kubernetes as the sort of flagship project. It was built to house Kubernetes, and then the execs or leaders in the foundation, in my opinion, wisely decided that if you are going to have a project, to make it real and make it applicable, especially when it's such a paradigm shift, there needs to be a tooling ecosystem around it so that people can really change the way they develop software. And so that's how tools beyond or projects beyond Kubernetes started getting accepted. The second project was Prometheus, which has become a household name, in my opinion, on metrics. And then it went from there. So today, if a project wants to get accepted, they have to, and I'm going to tell the fuzzy details because specific guidelines will be different because I don't remember them all. But they need to basically get sponsored by someone on the TOC, which is the Technical Oversight Committee, and then come up for vote in the Technical Oversight Committee about whether or not they get to join. And the criteria is extremely technical. It needs to be innovative, useful, and enabling cloud native software development, which is great. And they have multiple tiers. So sandbox environment is the first type, where the onus is sort of lower in terms of how much community you have. You just need to be an interesting technology. Then you sort of graduate to the next level, which is incubation. And at that point, the expectations are bigger in terms of governance, community, who else contributing. And then finally, there's graduation. And there's only, I think, 5 projects that have graduated out of a total 36 plus. Where the community guidelines are really a lot more. You need lots of organizations participating, a really inclusive charter and governance model, et cetera. And adoption is also a big factor. So there are tiers at which there are different projects. There's been talk of at some point having a clearinghouse also in the future. So right now it's been about accepting projects and seeing who moves up the chain. But in the future, it's possible that there will be some culling based on how the projects are performing from a technology adoption and governance perspective. So that's kind of the system right now. Now, in terms of funding, even though the CNCF would own the projects, that doesn't mean that they're the people funding it alone. Tons of companies contribute developer hours and time to each project, depending on where it fits in their strategic goals. And so the ecosystem around it is pretty robust.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of funny because I was noticing even in there, I didn't know what Envoy was. And so I looked that up, and it's a layer 7 proxy. And right. I was just And it was like, why Envoy instead of something like Nginx or, oh gosh, what's the other one? I can't think of it right now.
Linkerd.
Yeah.
So Linkerd is actually a part of CNCF as well. So the CNCF is clear that they will accept competing technologies, which I think is really awesome. And this goes back to them not wanting to be opinionated, but rather just collecting the right tech, and so people can make their own decision on whatever works for them. So yeah, Nginx is not there because I guess Nginx didn't apply. It can be as simple as that, actually.
Well, and Nginx also just got recently picked up by F5, I think.
Right.
Does the CNCF, are they providing funding for the further development of these, or are they just an IP clearinghouse?
They do not, as of now, fund the development. No, I would say IP clearinghouse, but they also help the projects in terms of guidance. So there's a few various, actually there's a bunch of angles. One is with organizing something like KubeCon every year in multiple countries and continents, as well as other events. They provide a way for these projects to connect with the end user community and also with the contributor community so that they can get more adoption and traction. And they have events teams that run the whole thing. They also provide, have partnerships with the cloud providers, companies like GitLab. So for instance, all CNCF projects will get, how much is it? 250,000 minutes free per month from GitLab CI pipelines. And so they have deals like that with different companies, and the project owners can choose whatever they want to do tooling wise. And then there's also mentorship and guidance available on how to run the project well and all of that stuff.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah, it's very cool stuff. I mean, big corporate partnership has definitely become a huge part of the way open source gets built and, kind of nourished, so to speak. So it's it's very official and it's like, it's got a nice website and everything. It's very clear that there was a lot of effort put into organizing this organization. And it's definitely has its roots in Google, right? But it's definitely now very collaborative, correct?
Agreed. 100% agreed. That, it started off with Google wanting a home for Kubernetes, and today everyone participates. We're not Google, we're GitLab, and I spend a lot of time in open source and in cloud native, and it's super awesome, inclusive community.
One thing that I kind of want to touch on with this is that you mentioned that GitLab right now you're moving to Kubernetes, and I've been talking to a lot of other companies. It seemed like Kubernetes got really hot probably a year or two ago, and so a lot of kind of the fast movers and shakers or people who were starting new projects kind of jumped on and picked things up as far as Kubernetes went. But now more of the mainstream is moving that way. So we're kind of at this transition point, I feel like, where you've got sort of a traditional DevOps that is, okay, we're going to spin up a server, spin up a VPS or whatever, and then we're going to point something like Chef or Puppet or Ansible or something at it and kind of terraform it to the point where it, it does what we want. And now we're going to build a container and we're going to spin it out that way. How is the cloud native foundation, how are they working to facilitate that transition?
Great question. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation, I don't speak for everyone, right. But as a board member, I can address this question from my perspective. I see the foundation making a lot of effort to educate the end users about the cloud native technologies, containerization, etc. Frankly, I have noticed over the years, these conferences that they put up, such as KubeCon, have become training grounds for companies. So if you look at a KubeCon or an OSCon, which is not put up by CNCF, but is a similar conference, there are tutorial days before the actual conference starts. And companies are sending their developers en masse to these sessions where they can just sit for the whole day and go through a workshop and learn. So it's almost like learning and development is being augmented by these conferences, which foundations like CNCF run. And that's been a really good way for developers to learn, not only in the classroom setting, but also in the hallway track from each other, from different companies. And I think the success of KubeCon which has been a very big event for our industry in the last few years, has sped up the adoption of container tech and Kubernetes across the ecosystem. I think another factor is just by providing such a stable home and neutral ground for Kubernetes and a lot of these other projects, they have created a trust in these projects from enterprises that they feel comfortable moving to these options. So I think the CNCF plays a critical role in this change in how we develop software.
And kind of leaning into the other conversation again, we've got this tools crisis, right, that we're talking about with DevOps. And I can see this transition point playing into that as well, right? Okay, well, currently we do things this way and we're going to move more toward cloud native. So how do we pick tools for that?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what happened. Oh, sorry.
So where do you see things going from here?
I think as an industry, we are moving towards a little bit more consolidation and cohesion. Up until a year ago, in fact, I joined GitLab a year ago, and I joined when I did because up until then, I didn't believe the single application message. I was really skeptical coming from a sharp-pointed solution that one tool can rule them all kind of thing. And I've come to learn at GitLab that is not actually what we're saying. But what I have come to understand is the need for a unified workflow. And that at first was just GitLab talking about it. And I didn't believe it, but then when I heard the story of how GitLab became a single application, we started as version control, and then a contributor contributed GitLab runners to build GitLab CI, and his point of view was like, you gotta just work with them together. And when they tried it, they just realized that the 1 + 1 was equaling 11, not 2. And that message, if you look in the recent past, we're hearing it from Azure DevOps, we're hearing it from GitHub Actions, we're hearing it from multiple sources now. So I think in the industry, there's an awakening that you need to standardize on some things. And I think we're doing it in a really good way, though, this time, because I don't hear parallelly that means we're going to shut out new tech, new innovation, new technologies. It's more that new tech develops and then over time starts getting sort of brought into whatever the cohesive workflow model is. And so I'm seeing it happen. The thought leadership is there. The product direction is coming, not just from GitLab, but other players as well. And I think in the next couple of years, it'll get more and more like that. Of course, we will discover new problems. And for that, there'll always be the exciting new tech project that solves it. But there will be just as much thought put into how to now integrate this into the rest of the workflow, as much as thought is put into coming up with the solution in the first place.
Interesting. That seems fairly similar to I hesitate to call it a movement, but I guess more of a design pattern for web services that I've heard of before. It's called the Fediverse, where it's a bunch of competing technologies, but they are all interoperable. They agree on hey, we're going to share activities in this particular format. So whether or not your client does, if your client's made by this project, it'll display it just fine. If it's displayed by this other project, it'll also parse just fine, so on and so forth. And it's interesting to hear some. There's huge differences too, but there's more than a little bit of similarity between that and what you were describing. Hey, everybody is. We have to realize we're on the same team, and we don't necessarily need to bring in new stuff that is just wildly different, just for the sake of being wildly different.
Yes, I really like what you said, a design pattern of the Federacy or Fediverse?
Fediverse.
Yes, that is super cool. And I think that that is the direction we are all going in. And I think it's for the better because the crazy heyday it was crazy.
Yeah.
And now there's a little bit of cohesion coming in, which good news for us all, I think.
All right. Anything else we want to shoot at before we go to picks?
Yeah. Something that I saw in your initial, I don't know if this was a pitch email forwarded by Chuck, But a topic up for discussion is, how the true promise of DevOps can only be accomplished by putting control in the hands of developers, which I think is very provocative. But then that's tempered by, and how we are so not there right now.
Yes. So I let me explain. So I think that, and this is my opinion, I think that for any technology or movement to truly get ingrained, it needs to go in the hands of the developers. A great example of that is cloud computing. AWS really kicked us off on this trend, right? And how did it get there? It was open to everybody to use. So operations people could get on the board right away. But the thing that really made this special was how every developer could just go spin up AWS and start using it for whatever project or whatever they were doing. And look at cloud computing today. It's ubiquitous. It's definitely here to stay. And I think that was because it transcended operations to developers really, really well. I think other technologies have come close, but not really stayed because they were just too complex to get into the hands of developers. They were not designed for that as well. I don't want to take names, but I'm sure you guys can guess. And that is, I think, where Kubernetes stands today. We have this talk about DevOps, this promise of DevOps, but if you think about it, we've gone from dev teams and ops teams to dev teams and DevOps teams. There's still a difference, and not every developer has easily accessed. It's not everybody is able to just go spin up a Kubernetes cluster and do whatever they feel like doing. And there's lots of reasons, right? People fear costs, etc. But that was true for cloud computing too. That is still true for that too, right? That's why people end up with huge AWS bills sometimes. In my opinion, it's a risk worth taking, because if Kubernetes is truly in the hands of developers, then it just becomes second nature to them. And then because it's so valuable, it's going to stick around. And I think the promise of DevOps has not been harnessed or achieved because this piece is still frictionful. I think we're asking developers to change their job and add almost 50% to it by going from dev to DevOps. And we have to meet them in their workflow to make this easy. And that's how we will really harness all the positives of like really fast cycle times, et cetera, until people are being expected to just like jump through a billion hoops to understand, to have access to Kubernetes clusters, to understand the monitoring, et cetera. It may not stick.
Indeed. I think another big roadblock to that is what I see as the chronic compensation problem in technology, as evidenced across people who are employed as developers and people who are employed as operations folks or SREs. I hear companies complain all the time, I can't possibly find good developer talent or good operations talent. And I'll just sort of sidle up and be like, hey, tell me a little more. What are you looking for? Oh, okay, here's this gigantic laundry list. Oh, how much are you paying? Oh, well, have you considered maybe doubling that just so you can get people in the door? And the answer is just, oh my goodness, we couldn't possibly. Like, well, I think I see part of the problem. If you're going to ask people to do more with less,
yes,
you might need to bump the compensation just a little bit.
I agree with that.
That's half of the conversation that very few C-levels or HR professionals want to have.
Yeah, I mean, one of the conversations I have a lot with customers is around this idea that we've moved. It started with moving infrastructure into VMware and virtualizing all our servers, and now it's everything's in the cloud, and now we're containerizing things. And what's happened is that we now, instead of a lot of physical infrastructure, we need a lot of software infrastructure, and that just is getting larger and larger and larger. It's actually the cloud has actually not made things simpler, but it's made it way more complex. And so now you need people that are kind of really, you have different skills, you have different ways that you're thinking about. I can remember it was maybe 12 years ago. I can remember buying a server, and I would install both the application and the SQL server on the same box, because it just was really heavily underutilized. And this was something that, the only redundancy really on this thing was like that it had like a RAID configuration, and there was no like automated backups onto multi AZs. There was no like multiple front end web apps. There was no, like automated failover of SQL Server and stuff like that. And now you can kind of buy those things very inexpensively. I mean, you literally can have a, like very small like website that's got all of those things I just discussed, and it costs you like $100 a month, on some like Amazon or, any of the big cloud providers. Right. And so I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, but like, it's something that maybe on the business side, it's nowhere near as obvious that is such a big difference that's just changed in a couple of years.
Well,
I 100% agree. Sorry.
Go ahead, please continue.
Oh, I was going to say that I 100% agree that the cloud has not made things simpler. It's definitely made things very different and created value for a new skill set. And that skill set, in my opinion, is like at least 2 people's worth of jobs in the old world. So naturally, it's a not common skill set. And like, the more we all need to get up to speed. That's why like the whole developers need to shift left thing is there. But yes, people need to compensate for that appropriately, to your point, Lee. That's where I think being open to maybe a remote workforce or some kind of, accepting people from different geographical regions is important. GitLab being all remote, this is something we've benefited from, where talent doesn't have a zip code. People can be anywhere, but purchasing power parity is different in different regions, and people can, companies and people can both benefit from when you open up your doors or computers to people in different locations. Like I work at a completely remote company. Today I'm in Santa Barbara. Tomorrow I'm going to be in San Francisco. It doesn't matter. I have colleagues in Warsaw and in South Africa, in New York, San Francisco. It doesn't matter. And I think that's really important, because there's just not that enough people who have this skill set right now.
Absolutely. And yes, remote working, I think, is practically a necessity for companies today. And I get very dismayed when I see these job postings. It's like, yes, not only do we have this, unusually low compensation range, but you have to be on our 20 square mile chunk of rock. If you aren't within our 20 square mile chunk of rock, we can't help you. Sorry. Have a nice day. And those job descriptions get reposted month after month after month. And you have to wonder what is the opportunity cost that they're losing out on.
100% agree. It's almost like you're asking for failure at that point.
Well, the other thing is that I've talked to more and more people that live in more and more remote locations, and you're ruling those people out. And the reality is their cost of living is probably lower. Their salary requirements are probably lower. So if that's a concern for you, you're missing the boat on that. And then a lot of these people are highly motivated and highly skilled, and they have the benefit of not having people walk by their desk every day and ask them dumb questions. I mean, no offense to any of the coworkers I've ever had, but that was always a problem. They'd come by and, hey, I've got a quick question. And by then you've broken my train of thought, and I've got to spend another half hour getting back into it. And so I always got way more done the days that I would essentially call in and say, I'm working from home today. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a real thing. It's not just the difference in the talent pool or anything else. It's, what people can get done, and the level of work that you can accomplish by having diverse people from different backgrounds working on this stuff.
I 100% agree. As I said, GitLab is all remote, and I work from home most days. And I've been road tripping this past 10 days. And so I go into co-working spaces because I need good Wi-Fi. And I'm remembering now just how frictionful it is to not work remotely at home, because so there's the excitement of, oh, I'm going to, dress up and go to work kind of thing. But once I'm here, it takes longer to get started. And then the shoulder tapping and like, someone next to me is playing ping pong. It's like, of course that's distracting me. And none of those things happen at home. And I get so much more done in like 6-7 hours of work at home than 8+ hours in an office. It's mind blowing. I 100% agree that the productivity boost of working from home is huge. I'm seeing it now.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is I work from home and I have 5 kids and I get more done at home. So, it's reality, I can shut the door. I mean, they're out for the summer, but I still get more done just because I can control my environment.
100% agree. I mean, my dog is always trying to sit in my lap at home.
Right? Dogs and 3-year-olds, my goodness.
They have zero sense of, okay, she's busy. They're like, well, you're here and your job is to be a cuddle puddle. So
you love me, right?
Right. It's so funny. But still, I get more done at home than in an office. Especially this open office concept is very, very...
I heard my evil laugh and someone else's evil laugh. So.
Oh, yeah, same here. The PTSD from open offices, especially when it's the operations team sitting next to the developer team, which isn't in and of itself bad, but when you've got the sales pit right across the way, and everybody wants to share the blue joke they heard at the bar the past weekend, or they get into a really, really intense sales call or something. It's just like, how did we get here? What?
Yeah, or you have the groundhog, prairie dog cube farm, right? Where it's, hey, Joe. And then Joe stands up, his head pops up. And then, because everybody's turning their heads and what's going on. And yeah.
I used to think it was just me. And I used to feel very like, man, I really don't know how to work, I guess, because I keep getting distracted sitting at this open floor plan. But after I've gone remote, A, I'm very productive is what I learned. And B, everybody was struggling with this whole open floor plan problem. Yeah. So I feel like a lot better.
My hack for that, honestly, was to get a bigger screen, right? So it blocked more of my field of view, and noise canceling headphones.
Yeah.
I am not joking.
My hack for that was to start my own company.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I got laid off that's when I started my own company. And then it was like, wow.
Yeah.
I worked 6 hours and I got twice as much done as I'd get done at 8 hours in the office.
So true.
Anyway, well, we've kind of gone a little bit afield from some of the topics we were on, but I think there are things that people deal with. So I was happy to let it go on, but we're kind of getting toward the end of our scheduled time, and I want to take some time for picks. So I'm going to go ahead and let our panelists go first. And just to give you an idea on picks, because I don't know, I got word yesterday that our prep documents disappeared in our website migration. So picks are things that you feel like the world should know about. So it could be TV shows, it could be tech tools, it could be books, it could be music, whatever, right? Whatever is making your life better. It's the frosting on the cake of life, I guess.
That's so cute. I love it.
So Lee, why don't you go ahead and share some picks real quick?
Sure. First pick for me is the Load Sharers project, and I just popped a link into chat here. Some of the people who've been working in technology for a fair amount of time might recognize the handle ESR or the name Eric S. Raymond. He's been working in critical infrastructure since 1992, and he has this project on there's single points of failure for lots of critical infrastructure. Not necessarily like CNCF or Nginx. I'm talking low-level stuff like the GNUPG project or OpenSSL or Emacs or NTPsec and all sorts of stuff that, it's one or two people working in their own time, but they've been doing it for years and years and years. They tend to be getting on in years, and their expenses are mounting, but nobody's paying the guy to develop GNUPG. And the Load Sharers project wants to bring some attention to those people, as well as give people of means some way to fund their work, not unlike Patreon or Subscribestar or things of that nature. It's specific to he calls them load-bearing internet persons. And he's got some great examples in the catb.org link that I've shared, and I think it's a wonderful idea, especially seeing how much critical internet infrastructure we're talking down to the level of handling buffer bloat on whatever switch you may be running in the last 10 years, levels of critical. So I would like to bring folks' attention to that. My second pick is a wonderful missive called Boring Technology, and their webpage is boringtechnology.club. And wouldn't you know it, in my gigantic tab sprawl in Firefox here, I think that while we're talking about the bleeding edge and all the fun things that we can do with it, it's good to refocus on what we're really here for, which is we're trying to drive the engine of business. And sometimes the best way to drive business is not to pick the bleeding edge. It's to pick, or at least consider seriously, the boring technology, the stuff that works, the stuff that is really well understood. All its failure modes are deeply documented and things of that nature. So that might be interesting for our audience to check out as well.
Nice. I'm going to throw in on the load sharers pick real quick. I hadn't heard of this one, but I wound up having conversations with people from codefund.io and the Sustain OSS organization, as well as Open Collective. And these are all groups that are trying to solve some of these sustainability issues in different ways. And we put together a show called Sustain Our Software. As we record this, it's not been launched yet, but it will probably launch right around the same time as this podcast launches. So if you're getting this one, you may also want to go check that one out if you're interested in something like load sharers. And I'm gonna push that their direction and see if they can get an episode on it. So
that'd be great.
Scott, do you have some picks?
Absolutely. All right. So I watched an interview by a guy named Byron Cook, who's the director of Automated Reasoning Group at Amazon. And what the Automated Reasoning Group does is kind of they build mathematical proofs that basically help you automate security checking or configuration checking. And that's it. A lot of the basis of a lot of the tools like Amazon Inspector, Amazon AWS Config, AWS Compliance, Macy, Guard Duty, Shield. These are all of these services, I believe, have some of this technology in there where there's a lot of ways that you could misconfigure SSL setups, or the way you improperly encrypt things. And so a lot of this is just kind of like how the cheese is made, so to speak. And so I've got a video link that I'll link to, and then I'll link onto the AWS website where they talk about provable security. And I just think it's a really fascinating way. And it's funny because this isn't even so much like, it's not AI or machine learning necessarily. It is literally like the application of like mathematical proofs against configuration and stuff. And it's really kind of a fascinating way that they do this stuff. So that's my one and only pick this week.
Nice. I'm going to jump in here with a few picks. One of my picks is something that you probably all take for granted. That's air conditioning. The air conditioning went out in the upper floor. We have 2 units, but the top floor, which is where my office is in my house, on Saturday, and it is now Wednesday. So I am a puddle in my office. So take a minute and take a deep breath of the air-conditioned air that you're sitting in, and realize how lucky we are to live in an age where we have it. Another pick that I have is, and it was mentioned during this episode, is I'm going to be at OzCon coming up in a few weeks. I met Priyanka at Velocity Conference, and I'm going to be at OzCon. I'm also going to be at Chain React, which is the week before, in Portland as well. And I'm really looking forward to interacting with some folks. So if you're there, go ping me on Instagram or Twitter. Twitter, I'm at CMaxW, and Instagram, I'm Charles Max Wood. And let me know what you're doing. let me know what you're looking into there, because I'm excited to interact with some people. But yeah, OzCon looks really, really terrific. And then I've also been listening to the Expanse book series. I watched the TV series first. It's on Amazon Prime. You can just watch it. The first 2 seasons were put together by Sci-Fi, and then I think they were going to cancel it or something, and Amazon picked it up and made the 3rd season. And they've done a really, really good job on it. But yeah, once you get past the 2nd or 3rd, maybe the 4th, I think it was the 3rd book, is as far as they've gotten with the movies or the TV shows. And they've done an excellent job. I've really, really been gratified by the way that they've done that. So I'm going to pick those. Priyanka, do you have some things you want to shout out about for us?
Yes, absolutely. I have a bunch. I collected them as you guys were talking. So I'll go through them really quickly. The first thing is the web ID in GitLab. I really like it because as someone who truly believes in Terminal and Sublime, I used to think web IDs suck. But over time, when I'm making small changes and quickly want to do stuff, this has been really handy tool, and I highly recommend it to anyone who can use it. That's one. The second thing I would like to recommend is if anyone is starting a business or thinking of starting a business in this world of adjacent to or related to cloud computing, I think it can be really challenging, especially because the hyperclouds, as we call them, with Amazon, Google, and Azure, it can be difficult to differentiate and find your value prop that isn't immediately swallowed by the clouds the minute they decide to add a feature. And Sid, our CEO at GitLab, gave a talk at Open Source Leadership Summit called Commercial Open Source Models in the Age of Hyperclouds, how to, GitLab bets on buyer-based open core. This talk is really useful in my mind for anyone who's starting a business in this field. Sid really talks from first principles, and I think it's valuable for folks. So I've shared that. Then the other thing I would like to share is so I got into infrastructure and distributed systems by way of observability. I used to just do web development before. And there was a paper I read that was really useful for me to sort of build a mental model, and that was the Dapper paper by Google. It speaks to the distributed tracing methodology they used to use at Google. I think now they use something called Census. But I think it's a very easy to read paper. It really gives you the basics of tracing, observability, and just how to think about complex systems at scale. So I highly recommend it, and I have posted the link to that as well. Oh, and my one last pick is remote work in general. I think remote work rocks, and every company should try it. And the key thing is that they should pick one, like go all remote or don't go remote at all, because half doing it is bad for both kinds of employees. And so there's a list of resources that I have here, which I'm going to share, which people can look at if they're considering it.
All right. One other question that I would like to have you share is if people liked what they heard and they're thinking, oh, well, I'd like more of her insights, where do they go to find you online?
Sure. I am overly active on Twitter, and my handle is almost my name, but not quite. It is Priyanka, and I'm going to type it here. It's Priyanka. Please find me there. I am very engaged over there, and I have open direct messages, and people can reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a really good time.
Yeah, thank you. It's great.
All right, folks, we're going to wrap this one up. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver